Okay, this is probably the kind of emphasis of this class, and I hope that most of you come away with something, at least that you are affecting the sea and you have an ability and perhaps a responsibility to do something about how the resources are used and how we conserve the species that live there. And so I have some Michael Jackson Heal the World going on in the background to start this. Also might help drown out the loud children, which I have. So humans, we are reliant on the sea. As our population grows, more and more people are using the sea as a resource. We have lots of different resources that we pull from the sea. And so this whole lecture is about that. This here is a picture of a bunch of what I believe are pilot whales, which is an odontocete, dolphin-like animal that were stranded on the beach. And the process for how and why these things occur is still a bit of a mystery. And when they occur, there's little you can do to help them. For some reason, they're in a deteriorated health state, and even when you get them back in the water, they don't recover. So a lot of them will die in these mass strandings. But it's pretty kind of emblematic of what we're doing with the sea. We're taking a lot of resources from it, and when we see disasters, we try and help, but by that time it's too late. The damage is already done. So it needs to be a more concerted and continual effort to make a difference. All right, thank you, Michael. All right, so modern uses of the ocean. We still have many cultures which are tied to the sea, and we call these maritime cultures. So those indigenous peoples generally which lived on the coast are reliant on the sea for their food, for resources that they use in making boats or shelters. And so those still exist, although they aren't as plentiful as they used to be, or aren't as dominant as they used to be. Shipping, we ship things all over the world, and the cheapest way to do that is to load a large barge full of shipping containers. The shipping container itself was a great actual invention. It standardized how we could pack things and sort things on these large barges. Before that, it was just like throwing a bunch of stuff on a boat in no particular order, but once you can shipping container, now things fit together easily and you can pack your whole container and do it that way. Tourism, so a lot of places, especially tropical, but also some non-tropical areas, rely on tourism, tourists coming to see the beautiful parts of the ocean, scuba diving, snorkeling, all that as well. And that's tied in with recreation, so diving, surfing, sailing, all these things occur on in the sea and other water craft. And of course, a big one is food. So there are fish, shellfish, kelp, etc. Lots of things which are taken from the ocean to used as direct resources for food. Okay, I don't know if you heard the yelling and stuff going on there, but I had to turn on a TV show for my kids, so I'll have a little more silence. Okay, so we'll start with food. Of course, fish are the things which are most edible and taken from the ocean, but you also have shellfish, oysters, clams, those sorts of bivalves. Other fish, other species such as jellyfish, sea cucumbers, polychaetes, and seaweed are also harvested. Not as much as the other ones, but you have like seaweed and kelp, which are used to make sushi rolls, and people just eat that as well. 1% of the total food consumption in the world is seafood, and 30% of animal protein is seafood. So it's a big resource. 1% doesn't seem like a lot for total raw food, but if you think of the protein that people are getting, a big chunk of it, almost a third of it, is from the sea. All right, here's a picture from the book of a catch, and you can see this is cod and flounder. There's a few, you can kind of see a few other species in there, different kinds of fish here and there. But as you can see, we've become pretty efficient at catching lots of fish and created a market and industry because of the efficiency in which we can take fish mostly. Now, with the fisheries, there becomes this trade-off between how much you take and then how much effort it takes. So that's what this graph is on the right. If you only take a little bit, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but you don't get a lot of resource out of it. The more and more you take, the more and more effort it is to take, because you are diminishing the stock and not allowing it to recover. So there's this trade-off between how much you take and then how hard you have to work to get more. And eventually, there's a stopping point. You see, there's a point at which it doesn't matter how much effort you do it, you can't get any catch because you've completely exhausted the resource. So from 1950s to the present, it is 5 times harder to catch the same amount of fish. And then in the 1980s, we've had since the 1980s, we've had an increase in effort, but still the same amount of fish is being caught. So this tells you that we are approaching further and further on this curve, with most of the fish. And in some areas, with one stock of fish, one species of fish, they'll almost completely go through this curve, and then they'll just switch to another type of fish. All right, this is what it looks like when the worldwide fishery. So most of it is marine catch. So that's just going out in the ocean and catching fish with your big nets. However, you can see this blue line. This is aquaculture. So when you look at the difference between the yellow or orange line and the blue line, the world marine catch has slightly decreased, but what has been making up the difference is marine aquaculture. And we talked about this in class. I had a discussion in class about some of the benefits and or negatives associated with marine aquaculture versus natural fishing. But this is the state in which we are at, or goes to 2010. So you can kind of extrapolate these lines. I would imagine they continue in a similar fashion through 2020. So it's 10 years ago, I guess. All right, major fishing areas are located in these cold, nutrient-rich waters with lots of fish close to the shore, and a lot of the catch is demersal species, which are off the ground, and that's because it's easier to catch something off the ground. They don't have anywhere to go, as opposed to something in the middle of the ocean. There's lots of primary production in these areas because of the cold, nutrient-rich water, and it has lots of photosynthetic activity. One example is the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, the North Sea, and the Bering Sea. So like Alaska, in between Alaska and Russia, northeast Canada, and we'll highlight some of these in a minute. This is then where those major fishing industries are. So you see those in darker blue, and if you overlaid a map of the cold and warm currents and the upwelling, you would find that those ones that are shaded in dark blue are also the ones where you have upwelling currents. So lots of fish in those areas, high productivity. So the cod fishery is a great example of what can happen if you aren't careful. So the fishery peaked in the 1960s. There's always been lots of fish, lots of cod in the northeast area of the United States, so New England, and then extending up into Newfoundland and Canada. However, so fishermen were getting better and better at catching the fish, extending greater effort, taking more and more out. It wasn't done very thoughtfully. And in 1992, there was a moratorium in this area because it had been overfished to the point where they were not recovering at all. And this led then to outcry because of the fishermen. Well, we need to fish. That's our job. You can't just say we can't fish. And a lot of fights, legal and employment otherwise, ensued, but the fishery has not recovered, and it may never recover because of the life history of the fish. It has a late age for sexual maturity, so it has to grow to be a large size before it can reproduce, and so it takes a long time for it to recover, and that wasn't taken into consideration when it was depleted. And so now these cod stocks are decimated and haven't recovered, and still an endangered species. So when we look at population growth and where we can and how much we can take, there are a couple things to consider. So one thing is that it is a renewable resource. So fishery stocks are something that will replenish themselves. So as long as we don't take too much, it should replenish itself. And finding then the amount that you can take, which is a maximum, where it will still replenish, can be done by determining the carrying capacity of the environment. So that's what that curve on the left is, the red one. If a population is undisturbed, it will operate at a specific population size where there's lots of competition. It's very hard for them to recover, and it has kind of a flat line, so a lot of them are dying. But if you can take a certain amount of them, you can decrease the amount of competition among those species, and the population rate can actually be very high. And so if you take anywhere along that red line where it's at a maximum slope, it should be able to recover. But if you take above or below, that maximum sustainable yield, that middle point, that inflection point, then you'll be taking too much, because it won't be able to recover. At least if you take that much every year, it's not going to be able to recover the amount that you are taking. Figuring out how much that is something you should probably do with a little bit of caution. So to get that exact amount would be great, but there's so much uncertainty involving populations and everything. You're going to have to practice a principle of caution, the precautionary principle. And that would be making sure that you can take quite a bit, but stay away from that point. Harvest above that point just to ensure that you don't accidentally go over. So the one on the right is the same thing. It's saying the same thing, but a different graph. If the population growth rate is kept at a point to the left of that MSY, maximal sustainable yield, you should be just fine, and it should be, the population size should stay very high. But you take to the right of that, and that's where the population will decrease. So when you exceed maximum sustainable yield, that's what we call overfishing. And at some point, even an increased effort will not increase the amount of fish, because there just aren't many there. If it is left unregulated, this generally happens. And if there's no science explaining how much is available and how much you should take, then what happens is fishermen act in a way similar to what is called the tragedy of the commons. We'll go over this in lecture as well. But essentially, everyone that has a boat, that has some nets, they realize, oh, there's lots of fish over here, and it's unregulated, and so we're going to catch as much as we want, as much as we can while it's still viable. And when everyone does that, it depletes the stock, and it's a tragic outcome of having no more sustainable resource. So 70% of marine fishes are overfished. So most fisheries are overfished, and this has probably grown since this data was taken from your textbook. The size of those that are harvested are much smaller. This has been documented in tuna species. The fish that they are catching are smaller and smaller because they're not allowing them to grow to full maturity. And this has also caused them to reproduce at a smaller and smaller size as well. So there's selection occurring, natural selection, or you could call this artificial selection, I guess, because humans are selecting for the bigger and larger fish, and so the stocks are getting smaller and smaller. This is not good for the organism and not good for the fisheries. So 10% of a historic high, if you are at 10% or lower, it's considered to be a collapsed fishery. And 1/3 of fisheries have already collapsed. And again, this number has probably increased. In a 2006 study, indicated that all major fisheries will collapse by 2050 if there's not a major change and regulation put in place. And it does more damage than just to the fishes and the fishery. It does damage to the whole ecosystem. Swordfish is another example of this. Catches of swordfish fell 70% between the 60s to the 90s. And a campaign to reduce consumption of these fish was successful, and they are now recovering. So this is great, right? So you fish less of them for a long period of time, and eventually they won't be able to rebound, and then you just, from there, try to decrease the take. Now these are big, beautiful, strong fish, and are also a fish that people like to catch because they are fun, they swim really fast, and there's a big fight. But yeah, you've got to practice good principles, or they'll just be wiped out. So the other dangers to fish is that the habitat itself can be destroyed in the process of fishing. So this is especially true for if you're catching demersal species across the ground, because you have a trawl, which is this big net which just kind of scrapes along the ground, and it not only picks up the fish, but it destroys whatever's on the ground and mixes things up. There's sediment flowing everywhere. And that can destroy nurseries and other organisms as well. So trawls are a problem, and it affects then the fishery that they're fishing as well, not only in the fish that they take, but in the habitat destruction that they do as well. So the reason why management, well, it seems simple. Well, why don't we just stop fishing? Well, there's a lot of dynamics to consider. One we already mentioned, it's hard to actually figure out what is the maximum sustainable yield. There's a lot of science and money and effort and resources that need to go into figuring that out. You've got the species that you harvest may compete with other species, and so that's going to affect a competitive balance. So you may be doing this species, well, this other species increases, and now you've created a dynamic that wasn't there before. Even modeling, those models don't have all the variables, so real fishing is more complex. And then there's, it used to be that next to the seashore, within 6 nautical miles, that's what regulated. They extended that to 200, but beyond 200, it's free off of your coast. It's free regulation, and so anyone can go there, and that's where you would have the common property and tragedy of the commons. So you can regulate your area, but you can't regulate another country's area, so that makes it hard. So there have been some attempts to rein this in, including the United States Sustainable Fisheries Act passed in 1996. It requires a plan to be put in place so that management can be done to avoid overfishing, to allow the stocks to replete themselves, and to reduce the bycatch. Bycatch is the things that get caught in the net that you don't want but are there, and so they generally die anyway, but to no avail. There's no there's no value in them. So the U.S. fishermen have to abide by these rules, as well as foreign fishermen that are in our waters or in those waters with valid permits. And then in 2003, the Pew's Ocean Commission also called for management not just of the fish, but of the whole ecosystem. So if you're just looking at the fish, that's one thing, but you have to take into, again, all the dynamics of that fish species and the other species interacting with it, and the ecosystem and the plants and animals and algae and everything involved. Otherwise, it's going to be an incomplete plan, and it's not going to be very helpful, as helpful at least. So perhaps some of the solution might be in mariculture and aquaculture. So mariculture is just growing things out in the sea in a contained area. You see these nets with the buoys and the a boat next to it, whereas you know, and then aquaculture is farming seafood, and this could be done not necessarily in the ocean, but could be done on in ponds on land as well, just with the right environment. So mariculture has risen threefold since 1990. So it's we saw that on that graph before. Farm fish account for 25% of shrimp consumed each year. And there's lots of different ones: milkfish, mollusk, seaweed, salmon, Pacific threadfish, and then tilapia is another big one that's not listed on there. Is this a solution? Should we just farm our fish and then let the ecosystems replenish? Well, what's hard about that are a number of things. So here's a little system set up for some aquaculture here. The hard things are, well, when you concentrate a bunch of fish in one area, then an outbreak of disease and parasites is pretty common. Sometimes the food requirements often include other fish. Now, sometimes you can just feed them like vegetable oil, and that would be preferable. But if you're just fishing other fish to go and feed these fish, then that's a problem, right? You can't have open water species like tuna because they need way too much ocean in order to survive. Water quality maintenance. So you've got all these fish concentrated. They poop and create their own pollution. And where's that got to go? Well, it's got to go in the ocean. So you're creating an environmental problem while solving a different one. And then what if you have a species that is not native to that area and you're farming it and it escapes into the ocean or into the surrounding waters? Well, then you have an invasive species, and that can cause a lot of problems as well. Another thing is, well, wherever you put them, there was an ecosystem there, and that ecosystem often has to be destroyed. So this happens with like with shrimp farms. They'll create these very important mangrove, they'll destroy these very important mangrove ecosystems to put in their shrimp farms, and the net value is probably lost. So yeah, you're creating fish, but you destroyed something that was important for lots of other different types of fish and nurseries, and is a very diverse and valuable ecosystem. So it's maybe some part of the solution, but not. There are so many problems associated with it. It's hard to say that this is going to be the wave of the future and going to solve all our problems. All right, so switching then a little bit, there are some other things which are not fish, which are important for humans, including, I just mentioned mangroves. They are important for timber and also for making charcoal. We have pearls, shells, corals, sea turtles, all these things from the sea which can be used for jewelry. And some species are also harvested for their chemical compounds, could be used in natural products. Also medicinal products are sometimes found from different organisms in the sea. Recreation, there's recreational fishing, which include people going out on these chartered boats to, catch a big fish. And they have guides, and about 30% of the amount caught by commercial fishermen is done by recreational anglers. Some species are exclusively from recreational anglers, and that would probably be these endangered species such as swordfish. The aquarium trade is also used to collect organisms and put them in aquariums for people's pets. So that's kind of actually a big industry as well. We also use the sea for non-living resources such as oil and gas. So there's offshore drilling. There's also wind turbines. So that's not mentioned on here, but you can do offshore wind turbines and or use the tide to create energy as well. There are also a number of desalination plants which are popping up. So that is taking salt water, letting the or using a process to filter out all the salt and making fresh water out of it. It's still kind of expensive for now, but there are some plants which are able to do that. This is important, especially in arid environments which are close to the sea. So the problem is with it, it creates a lot of salt. And then what do you do with that salt? You throw it back in the ocean, you create a very salty environment which wasn't there before. Okay, and then there's also sand and gravel which can be harvested from the ocean. All right, recreationally, so beyond anglers, we've got surfing, scuba diving, snorkeling, boating, swimming. All of these are fun things to do in the ocean, and I've definitely participated in lots of these. And yeah, it's a great way for people to experience nature and hopefully gain an appreciation for it. But there's also a lot of negative things that come with this, and that is litter, trash. People are inconsiderate and will, damage ecosystems. Too much foot traffic, and sometimes people will collect corals, which is not a good idea, and harass wildlife and displace wildlife. And so there's got to be a balance there as well. Some habitats have been modified and destroyed, especially if you put in a high-rise resort, it's going to destroy land. So one area in southern, in Florida, the Panhandle, and those areas around the Gulf, a lot of the areas will destroy habitat for this endangered beach mouse. And actually, when you go down to the Gulf, you'll see areas fenced off, or with bridges going over them, saying you can't disturb this habitat because this is important for these endangered mice. And so there are ways around it, but again, wherever you set up a human habitation, you're destroying habitat for living organisms. Okay, I mentioned coral reefs. A fourth of all coral reefs have been destroyed or at risk. This has increased. So I've heard statistics: half of coral reefs are already dead or bleached. Of course, there's pollution, sewage, sedimentation, rising temperatures, collection, all these things. But the biggest danger right now is rising temperatures and bleaching events, which cause them to all die. There is some information, however, showing that coral reefs are migrating to cooler waters. Well, we were once cooler waters, and now those cooler waters have warmed up, and so there's some movement of coral reefs. But overall, the way that they have been historically has changed significantly. All right, we mentioned trawling and how it's a pretty destructive practice to subtidal habitats. The nets also stir up a bunch of water, which can kill filter feeders or suspension feeders. It can also attach to organisms and make them less viable. So trawling, which is a major way that fish are collected, is a problem as well. All right, we pollute water in lots of ways. We have used the ocean as our garbage dump for a long time. Everything that goes into the waterway eventually goes into the ocean. So fertilizers that are used for our plants, for our agriculture, eventually a lot of that, not all of it, gets absorbed by the plants. Some of it goes into the runoff and goes into the river, and that creates problems for algal blooms. Sewage as well. We have oil and oil spills. We'll talk about one of them in a minute. And persistent toxic substances such as DDT. So DDT was used as an insecticide for many years, and it's created a lot of problems all the way through lots of marine life, all the way up to marine seabirds. We don't use DDT anymore, but it has caused a toll on sea life. And there are other things such as mercury and heavy metals, which also accumulate in sea life. So I talked about fertilizers and how they end up in the ocean. This causes algal blooms. So basically, algae, the primary producers, are limited because they don't have enough phosphorus and nitrogen. Well, fertilizer is very rich in those, so when you have a big input of those, then the algae go crazy and grow at an exponential rate. And what this does is it prevents other organisms from being able to grow because they eat up all the oxygen, they shade lower parts of the ocean, of the water, and so plants below it can't grow, and then fish die, and it's really gross and bad for other organisms. Sewage, we have our domestic sewage, which is mostly treated. However, some of it is not necessarily good for the waterways, and depending on how good your wastewater treatment plant is, that can affect what's in the water. Industrial sewage from factories and or animal products and or meat. A lot of that is disposed of using water, and so that needs to be treated and disposed of properly. And then may contain these things we already talked about: disease-causing organisms, heavy metals, or other toxic substances. All right, oil spills are very bad when they occur. Now, they do occur somewhat naturally, but nothing on the level and scope of which we see when we have an oil spill, such as the Exxon Valdez oil spill or the Deep Horizon oil spill. What makes oil so bad is it accumulates on organisms, and then they can't breathe, or they can't swim, or their feathers are no longer waterproof, or they eat it, or they ingest it somehow, and then it becomes toxic and they die. And so cleanup efforts, chemicals which help disperse the oil, and then taking and rescuing wildlife and cleaning them are all ways in which you try and minimize the effects. But when it happens, it's devastating. It just creates so much death for the wildlife. So the Deep Horizon oil spill, which occurred in 2006, I want to say, I can't remember exactly. It was the biggest oil spill ever, 170 million gallons of oil, 8,000 birds, sea turtles, and marine mammals were found dead or injured, and that's just the ones we found. There's plenty of them, I'm sure, that died that we didn't find. The corals were covered and killed. You had a 5-time increase in sea turtles strandings. Took 4 years for herring populations to collapse after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So there's going to be long-term effects, and I think what we'll do for our reading is a study on how the Gulf has recovered since. So we don't know what's going to happen in the long term, and scientists are keeping an eye on what's going on and how species are recovering. All right, so we mentioned persistent toxic substances such as DDT and heavy metals. What happens is, because they're persistent, that means that they can't be excreted, and they can't be, animals don't have ways to get rid of them. And so at each level of the trophic, each trophic level, essentially, you have a biomagnification where the organism which lives longer, every time it eats these smaller fish which don't live very long, it's going to accumulate more and more of the poison, more of the persistent substance. And this is true with DDT, mercury, all these heavy metals. So there's a minimal amount in the water. The producers absorb some of that. Zooplankton eat that. Small fish eat that. Large fish eat that. And at each level, you have an increase in how much is being accumulated as they eat the next level below it. And then because they live longer, it accumulates longer, and then it causes all sorts of physiological problems for them. DDT almost caused the extinction of the bald eagles. They have since rebounded actually quite well. But other organisms are still rebounding from the effects of DDT. All right, a big one, solid waste. So plastic. Plastic is all over the ocean. It's actually all over our waterways. It's everywhere. There are giant patches of plastic debris floating in the ocean, one the size of Texas in the Pacific. Basically, where the currents all circle together in the middle of the ocean, all this floating plastic accumulates. And this is bad for organisms because they think the plastic is zooplankton or phytoplankton. They eat it and they ingest it, and it's not. They aren't able to digest it, and it gets stuck in their body, and then it kills them. Seabirds especially eat a lot. Sea turtles, they'll eat plastic bags because they look like jellyfish. Whales, all animals have been found stranded and dead with different types of plastic stuck in their stomach. Second effect of this is we're going to eat fish that are eating plastic, and so you can also consume plastic, which it's mostly benign, but if it accumulates in your system, it cannot be a good thing as well. Plastic also is made with different types of chemicals, and those chemicals can leach into the water, can leach into organisms, can leach into you. All right, so overall, the species of the ocean aren't doing well. Many of them are endangered, threatened, or vulnerable, especially coral. We have 236 species that are threatened or endangered. And fishes, sea turtles, the marine iguana, well, there's only one species of those. All these things that we've studied are, not all of them, but many of them, because of the abuse the ocean takes, these organisms are victims of that. All right, we talked about the stellar sea cow. This is a great example of essentially just overfishing, just killing something until harvesting it until there are none left. So I mentioned I didn't know dates before. It became known to science in 1741, and then it went extinct, 27 years later. So not very long after its discovery, not discovery by indigenous people, but by scientific community, white people essentially, they went extinct because they were big, delicious, slow. They weren't really afraid of humans, and that's a recipe for disaster. Other species in peril today: whales, due to over-whaling or overfishing. And then I have a history of whaling, which is a separate video which I'll post, which is already posted to Canvas. You can check that out as well. Clams, especially like abalone, are no longer allowed to be collected because of how rare they are. You have big shells collectors are taking. That also prevents them from being able to be used. Sharks, there's shark fin soup, was a big thing in Asia, and sharks are being killed at a phenomenal rate. They are generally done in the open ocean where there's not a lot of regulation, and most sharks are endangered and not doing very well. Sea turtles as well, most of them were endangered. We talked about that as well. And that's because they make pretty jewelry. You can make them into ukuleles, or just preserve their bodies and make a little trinket toy out of them. So all of these things come at an ecological cost for these species. So in 1982, the U.S. developed a law which extended that zone to 200 miles of the coast. So now we can manage more of our coast, which is good. because before, beyond, I think it was like 6 or 12 miles or something, it was open ocean. Anyone could go there. There's also United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, developed in 1992 to preserve biodiversity. They don't seem to be doing very well. One of the things, however, which has been pretty successful is creating marine sanctuaries. There are 14 in the U.S., and basically there's no fishing, no recreation. This is a place where it's left pristine. And what's great about it is it creates this place where species and the ecosystems are all doing well, and it has a spillover effect where areas next to it can also then be vibrant. They should be expanded, in my opinion. So they are the most successful, and they have lots of community support. Seeing lots of wildlife is great for communities and great for every aspect of our dependence on the sea. There are also opportunities for you to volunteer and get involved in helping organisms, including sea turtles. There's marine stranding networks. These are done by not volunteers, but government agencies, which will go and help sea life as it becomes stranded and figure out why they're stranded, if it's dead, how it died, if you can somehow get it back into the sea and help it survive, do that as well. So essentially they are called when needed to help these animals when they wash on the shore and assess the situation and help them out as much as possible. Aquariums and rehabilitation. So this is kind of a two-edged sword. You've got education which goes on in aquariums, which is great. There are some things which I think are beyond aquariums, which would be like SeaWorld, where it's really a business. It's more than just an educational experience. There's a lot going into training and having these organisms do shows for people. And then on the other side, there are these nonprofit organizations which take injured animals and rehabilitate them and help them either return back to the wild, or if they can't return back to the wild, provide a safe place for them to live out their lives. Dolphin Tell is a great example of a rehabilitation of a dolphin that lost its back its back fin. Blackfish, on the other hand, exposes some of the practices of killer whale aquariums. Over a few decades, it follows this one whale which actually ended up killing people. This is a pretty good, pretty influential documentary. I would recommend watching it. There are some research that also comes because of these things, including how marine mammals communicate. So there are some ethics involved. Should we be keeping these large mammals, which require a lot of ocean to be healthy, in our sea world so that we can watch them do shows, so for our entertainment? I don't know if there's a good answer for that. Well, I have an opinion, but I'm not going to share it here. All right, so with that being said, we are done with the with this PowerPoint lecture. We'll split this up into a few different in-class recordings. We'll do some drawings, look at a few things, and then have an exam ready for you guys. All right, thanks.